Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Humm. I'm one of the Dialogue Doctor Coaches, and I'm here today with Jenny Wilson. Jenny, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your author journey?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me on, first of all. And I've been writing pretty much forever, my whole life, but I don't have anything published yet. My first book is due to come out in April of 2025.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And it's the first in a series. And so now I'm working on book two of that series. And then I also have a short story that's available on my website. So that's currently out and about in the world. So that's kind of exciting.
That's fantastic. Do you want to share your website?
Sure. My website is under my pen name, which is jsuzannewilson.com. And Suzanne is spelled Susanne.
Perfect. That's great. So this is the second book in the series that we're going to talk about today.
Yes.
Excellent. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about what you're hoping for us to accomplish today?
Yeah, so I'm currently getting ready to start. I'm a plotter, so I'm getting ready to start my outline. And in the past, I worked with Jeff on voice modulation throughout the character's journey. And I thought that would be really great to kind of get a grasp on that before I even start this time. So I think that getting a hold on her voice modulation throughout her character arc will help me plotting the scenes and like when things need to happen and stuff like that. So
Excellent. That sounds great. And are your characters the same characters from book one, just on a new part of a journey?
some of them, yeah. So
Okay.
this is the basically this is the same time period as book one, but from a different point of view, from a different character's point of view.
Excellent. I love that in a series to be able to stay within the world, but just be able to adjust a little bit to a different character. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And your story, you sent me a little bit of a summary overview. You're looking at Greek mythology.
Yes. Yeah. I'm doing Greek myth retellings. So
That's
yeah.
fantastic. All
Yeah.
right. Anything else you want to share before we start talking about book two?
I can't think of anything.
Okay,
No.
sounds great. So why don't you start by telling me a little bit about what you're hoping to accomplish in book two and where the pain points have been for you in your plotting of your character and the arc and the voice. And then we'll kind of help answer some of those questions if we can.
Sure. Yeah, so this is a tragedy, so it does not have a very good ending. And I'm viewing it as a negative character arc, but I might not be using that term correctly, but she starts out as, kind of an innocent, happy little girl and then ends as a woman who kills her mother. So I guess what I'm looking for is, how does that journey look, I guess,
Hmm.
from, happiness to absolute tragedy. And then as far as pain points go, I in my first book, I wasn't quite sure how to hit the middle, I guess, like while keeping it interesting and not getting the dreaded saggy middle. And then also wasn't sure how to end it. So I figured it out, but I'm kind of hoping maybe this conversation might help me with those two things.
Yeah. Okay. So you have a really strong beginning. You know where your end point is, but getting from that beginning to the end feels a little bit muddy. Um, Rest assured that that is a very common thing that we hear a lot in the community. It's easy when we kind of look back on our lives and we see all the different moments that got us to where we are. It's a little bit harder when we're trying to project someone else's story. So figuring out all those important points can be difficult. So you are starting the story. Your main character starts as a young child, happy, and then you said things turn tragic for her, and she's going to kill her mother.
Mhm.
Um, Are you planning to tell the story chronologically? She starts as a child, ends as an adult, or are those child scenes like reminiscent, like her as an adult thinking about what her childhood was like and kind of figuring out how she got to the place where she's living in tragedy?
Yeah, my plan currently is to start later and then have her childhood be more, handled in backstory and
Okay.
flashbacks. I will say that's how I planned to do my first book, but ended up changing and going chronologically. So,
Hmm.
I'm open to whatever the story needs to be, but my current plan is to start fairly late.
Okay.
And
Um,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but the whole thing takes place over the course of 11 years. So,
okay. Yeah, an 11-year period can be difficult to span in one book without flashbacks.
mhm.
It absolutely can be done, especially if there are periods where um, you're asking the reader to understand what happened in a space. Like here's part of the story, pause, jump ahead 5 years. Here's part of the story, jump ahead 5 years. That can be easier in an 11-year span, not to say that it isn't completely possible to write an entire story of even more than 11 years. Lots of authors are very successful at the longer time spans. I just think that and what you're doing now, like figuring out what your plot is and how you want to use those pieces become really important. Especially in a story that is a tragedy, thinking about what you want the reader's experience to be. Do you want them to start in tragedy and then throughout the middle of the story understand how we got to this point and then figure out the forward? Or do you want it to be more of a this starts with lots of hope and then ends in tragedy? It all kind of depends. And I think one of the things, because this is book two, understanding what happened in book one and what the emotional journey for your reader was in book one, and then if you can plan ahead a little bit to book three. Um, I forgot to ask. You said it's a series. Is it a trilogy or is it multi-book series?
I'm planning five.
Five. Okay. That gives you a lot more flexibility. When you have three, book two needs to be the bridge between one and three. When you're doing a series, you have a lot more flexibility and a lot more freedom. So that's really great. Um, what are you struggling with as far as plot points, character voice? What are the things that you want to talk about today specifically?
Yeah, well, one of my concerns or my issues is I don't want to make her a villain. Um, I think that she has been vilified historically, and I would like,
Hmm.
but also she killed her mother, so I want to make her voice, I want people to be able to relate to her at some level, I
Hmm.
guess, throughout the story. So that's kind of one of my biggest concerns.
I love that. There's been a lot of de-villainification. I don't know, I'm making up words now. De-villainizing villains Disney's been doing it for a lot of years, right? Like taking Cruella and some of the other villains that we love to hate and making them, giving us the backstory, understanding how this person gets to be where they are. So I think the genre that you're targeting definitely has a wide audience. But I also think, kind of knowing the Greek myth that you're talking about, there is a lot of space in the story for an understanding of how someone experiences trauma and their reaction to it is tragedy, right? I definitely think that you have a lot of space in this story to really humanize your character. She loses a sibling very early on, and instead of finding comfort in her mother pushes her away repeatedly, repeatedly, repeatedly. And that trauma really gives you a space to be able to write a character who is very complex, but is also very likable, despite the fact that at the end of the story, or depending on kind of where you're telling the timeline, if the end point is the death of her mother, that's one thing. But then what happens after the death of her mother and how she lives with herself also gives you a lot of space to be able to make her likable and understandable. If you're telling a story in a place where she really has no choice, but to make this decision that makes a character much more likable and understandable, even though, you know, is that a decision we would make today? We don't
Mhm.
know, right? Like you're talking about Greek mythology, so you're talking
Yeah.
about a totally different culture.
Yeah.
So there's definitely room for that.
Mhm.
Um, in your goal to make her likable, what are you finding is the easiest part of that, and what are you finding is the hardest part of that?
Well, the easiest part is definitely when I think of her younger years when she loses her older sister. And she's definitely, well, she's a likable character. She's happy and fun and everything. And then also very, I think that most people would be able to empathize or sympathize with her as her mother pushes her away.
Hmm.
So that part seems, fairly straightforward. It's kind of the turning, the gradual turning against her mother, where, she goes from wanting comfort and love from her mother to just pure hatred of her
Hmm.
mother to the point where she's willing to kill her. So, that has to take place over time. And I'm not really sure how, I mean, I have 11 years to make that happen. So does it
Hmm.
happen right away? Or does it happen right at the end? Or is it more of a gradual
Hmm.
arc? So,
Yeah, I really like what you're saying in this, like the empathy that you want your reader to be able to have for your character of how does it feel to want something so badly and be denied over and over and over again? And what does that feel like in how we how we see kind of our lives go, wanting something and being denied can either make us want it even more and change in a way that allows us to like get closer to what we want, or it does this other thing that you're talking about, which changes us to, well, if I can't have it, then there are going to be some dire consequences. So I think that the challenge that you're going to have is if you want your character to remain likable, you want to make sure that that understanding of what that tipping point is really clear and easy for your reader to understand. So they're like, yeah, she really has no choice here. If she continues to allow her mother to do this to her, then she's just going to continue to feel the trauma over and over and over again. But you also are going to need to explain why this is the only choice, right? Because we have a lot of freedoms and flexibilities in 2025 that we didn't have in ancient times of like getting away from someone. Well, you can just cut them off or move to a different city or whatever. You don't actually have to resort to murder.
right.
But it was different in ancient times. So really making sure that your reader has an understanding of why just leaving isn't an option, whether it's her space in society, whether it's because her mother isn't just doing this to her, her mother is actually um, poses a risk to the whole community, really like helping the reader understand. And in order to not vilify your main character, you're going to kind of have to vilify the mother. A reader likes a villain, right? So having somebody to blame, having that piece of understanding could be really helpful.
So can I ask you a question? because the mother is one of the characters that I'd like to write a book about in a future,
Uh-huh.
part of the series. And she does a lot of really bad things also, but I don't want her to be a villain in her own story either, which I don't think anybody's a villain in their own story.
Right.
So I guess that's something that I need to think about now is how, I mean, from Electra's point of view, her mom is a villain.
Uh-huh.
But is there any way for me to kind of lay the groundwork for future stories where maybe she's not quite as evil as she seems?
Absolutely. And that's the beauty. I loved what you just said there. And I think it's very true. No one's the villain in their own story, right? And that's the beauty of storytelling. If you tell a story from one perspective, there's a clear villain. And then if you tell the story from a different perspective, the person that from the outside looked like the villain is actually the hero in their own story. And you have a much better understanding of the reasons and the rationales and the purpose in doing the things, and you get to reveal those things that no one else gets to reveal. I definitely think it's why Disney is going back and giving you the backstory of all the villains because there's this understanding, this humanizing of a villain to realize that we're taught as children to think right and wrong are very clearly defined. But as we grow up in the world, we realize that it's much more nuanced than that. And most of us aren't faced with a choice between good and evil, right? Like Electra isn't one day waking up and is like, oh, I'm just going to murder my mother because she's there, right? Like, no, there's a whole history, there's a whole backstory. But often especially when we're entrenched in trauma, it can be difficult to understand somebody else's perspective. So I think being able to tell Electra's story where her mother is the problem, and then be able in a couple of books later, either within the series or as a standalone, to be able to tell her mother's story so we have this understanding of it. There's a huge trend in that now in literature. So I definitely think that your idea works, especially at this point in time.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, good.
yeah, excellent. All right, so what else can I help you with? Or how can we dig deeper into this question that I can help you with?
Yeah, so is there a way to kind of pinpoint so when I met with Jeff about my first book, he spelled out like, here she's going to have short um sentences that are
Hmm.
brief and to the point, and then as she gets more comfortable, she's going to, open up to certain people and then stuff like that. Is there a certain pattern or anything that I might follow for somebody who's going on the opposite arc?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, your first story was like a hero's arc. Somebody's,
Yeah. Yeah. So she started out, in trauma, and then the end of her story is she's got more of a happy ending.
hmm.
And, she finds her tribe and she figures out who she is in the world. And Electra's not going to get to do that. So I'm not sure. I guess I don't know. Maybe I'm not asking the right question.
Yeah, you're absolutely asking fantastic questions, and this is definitely, voice is definitely something we're very passionate about at the Dialogue Doctor. So you're definitely asking the right questions. Let me pose a few questions to you before we start kind of scoping out what the character voice is going to sound like, because how you're portraying the journey and how you're portraying Electra is going to help define what her voice is going to sound like at different points in the story.
Okay.
Um, so I think the first big question that we have is you are defining the story as a tragedy in that her life has been a struggle and she's making the decision that her mother can't go on living, right?
Right.
Is the death of her mother the end of the story, or is it a turning point in Electra's life and you're going to continue the story after that?
I plan to continue it briefly after that, just to kind of give readers an idea of what happens next, but not necessarily go terribly long with that.
Okay. How does the death of her mother change the trajectory of her life? Does it give her space and freedom? Does it, is she a Lady Macbeth and is out damn spot out? How does the death of her mother impact her in the long run?
That's part of what I'm still trying to work out. I don't know. Definitely not Lady Macbeth. You know, so I don't know the answer to that, I guess. I
Okay.
still need to work on that.
Yeah, so the reason that I ask that is when you're thinking about character voice and character arc, you want to think about what you're leaving your character, excuse me, what you're leading your reader with at the end of the story, because that's the voice that usually your reader remembers, right?
Okay.
Like the end of the story. We remember how someone got to a place, but when we walk away from the book, the character that we're taking with us for the rest of our memories is who that person is at the end. When we
Okay.
think of tragedy, we think of someone who is either dead or they're set up for a really painful future existence, right? If the story that you're telling of Electra is pain and trauma as a young child created a situation where she was entrenched in tragedy, but she made this move that gave her hope, then your reader walks away from the story with this idea that she did what she had to do, not, oh my gosh, she's horrible because she murdered her mother. And now, right, like the rest of her life is going to be, she's going to be haunted by that. Those are two really different endings to the story. And thinking about what you want your reader, because in an ideal world, authors are writing stories that they want their readers to carry with them through the whole rest of their memories, right? Like nobody wants to write a book that is forgettable. So being able to attach your reader to that out experience, that's such a weird way to put it. The end of the story, like are are we hopeful? Are we scared? Are we depressed? Does this look like 20 more years for Electra of grief and tragedy because her mother is dead and now she has to deal with that? Or is it the source of her pain is gone and now there's room to grow and love and have space and be loved? Those are two really different endings.
Mhm.
Where ending ties into character voice is if you want your character to have a hopeful potential, then you want the voice at the end to be strong and powerful and capable and hopeful. If you want that kind of telltale heart ending of, oh, this is just going to get worse for her as you go, kind of the
Mhm.
Lady Macbeth, then that voice is going to be different. And it doesn't have to be all or nothing, right? It can be, I have this hope that something is going to be better for me. I'm going to have space to love and be loved. But how can anybody love me if I did this horrible thing of killing my mother, right? Like you can have that hope, but also that place of fear tied into it. It doesn't have to be just one thing that we take with us at the end. And then once, because, writing is so easy, once you have your ending voice, then you kind of have to work backward from the story to say, who do I want her to be at the beginning? We want her to be likable enough that we want to spend an entire story with her, but we also need to see the potential growth for her in that story of, what happens and how do we realistically go from point A to point B? Where are the highs and the lows? So
Okay.
I just threw a whole lot at you.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, I need to kind of work out my ending and then work backwards, it seems like.
So, in an ideal situation, yes, but we don't all work in that format, right? If you have a voice or a point in time in the story where you are hearing Electra's voice or you know what her actions are going to be and what her personality is going to be,
Mhm.
start there and then we
Okay.
can work forward and backward from that point in time. There's no necessarily one right or wrong way to write a story. I always coach from the perspective of find the easiest point for you and then figure out the story from that point. If the ending feels murky to you, but the beginning feels really strong, let's start with her voice at the beginning and give you some options for working to the end. If
Okay.
the middle part of Electra, and you can think about middle part being chronologically in her story, not necessarily the middle point of your book, then let's
Mhm.
start there and we can talk about some of the stuff that could have happened before or some of the stuff that can happen after.
Yeah, I actually do have a pretty strong feel of her voice in the middle. I feel like she's a pretty external character. My first book, the main character was very internal, and Electra's the exact opposite of that. And so she's not very super self-aware, I don't think, but then she's also pretty moody, and she's also I feel like she's very she just gets stuff done. Like she
Okay.
doesn't really think a ton about kind of consequences.
Okay.
While at the same time, she is trying to plan her own escape because she's being held. Like part of what she doesn't like about her mom is that her mom won't let her leave the palace.
Hmm.
So she's kind of trying to. She'll do basically anything to get out of the palace.
Okay. So she's a character who is in a desperate situation
Hmm.
and is very impulsive and looks for opportunities for escape, looks for opportunities to um, be free and be rid of the situation. Again, captive makes for a very empathetic character. We can all draw on a time or a place where we felt trapped either emotionally or physically, and that allows us an opportunity to kind of empathize with the character. Um, so that works really well. Um, Now, is she plotting and planning for an escape, or is she just looking for opportunities and taking those opportunities, kind of consequences, be damned, right? Like,
Yeah, I think probably the second. Probably just if she sees something, she goes for it,
okay,
rather than trying to formulate her own way out
okay,
until the end when she does.
right, okay. So if you're looking at that, that gives you a really easy growth arc, right? You can have someone who um, feels desperate and takes every attempt and every opportunity, in which case you want to play up the um, the trapped feeling, the desperation in her voice. And then as she has failed attempt after failed attempt after failed attempt, then that teaches her a little bit of temperance, right? It teaches her this idea that there are consequences to my actions. Maybe if I take a deep breath and I step back and I look at the situation and I learn from my mistakes, then I can actually create a plan and look to what happens after I get out. And that can kind of go towards the end of your story as well, of like, you know, also creating a character that's likable if she's, thinking about her escape and the impact that her escape has on her mother and whatever punishment she ends up doling out to her mother, if it doesn't feel like an act of an angry teenager who's frustrated in the moment, flies off the handle, and just doesn't care about the consequences, that's going to make a character who's much more unlikable than a character who's really able to think through and understand what the implications of their actions are.
Okay.
So it gives you kind of an easy growth arc that helps your reader feel the fear and the desperation and the desire, but also understands that there are consequences when we do these things, right? Like in a desperate situation, getting out of this is really great, but what happens when we get out? Do we have a place to go? Do we have a plan? And like those failed attempts that she has to get out can help her realize that okay, well, if I get out of here, getting out isn't the whole plan. There has to be more after it. Readers can really kind of connect with that because we've all tried the trial and error of like, but then what happened if we actually did get out of here? Are we just
Yeah.
going to end up right back, right? So kind of giving them the opportunity to see that. And that's kind of an easier thing to do in voice. Um, but before I talk about voice real quick, does she have someone that she trusts and she can talk to throughout the story?
Yeah, I was thinking about giving her a friend or even like a sibling, like a half sister or something like that.
Okay.
Mhm.
And is she trying to take her friend or her sibling out with her, or does that person stay behind?
Well, so her only real way to escape and realistically is through marrying a man. So, I mean, because she's a woman
Hmm.
3,000 years ago, so she couldn't, like, her escape isn't necessarily physically leaving the area. It's getting out from her mother's control and then under somebody else's control. So, um, I would say no, she wouldn't be planning on taking her friend with her.
Okay. As you think about that story and what escape looks like for her, knowing that marrying becomes her only escape. At some point, trading one captor for another can feel kind of anticlimactic to a reader. So
Okay.
maybe thinking about, okay, I'm going to trade my mother for marriage. She sees that as another trap, but then the person she ends up meeting and marrying is someone who doesn't treat her like her mother treated her, which is pushing her away and she's just something to be dealt with, but actually like listens to her opinion or, right, like, so it can feel like a freedom in a way that she never knew freedom could feel like. Or you could go a different way and she can see that as her only opportunity. So she finds a way to craft the marriage to be with somebody that she can control. And while society says he has all the power in the relationship, she's actually manipulating him to do her bidding. So she feels that freedom. Um, Definitely, it's a challenge to write a story of freedom for women centuries ago because there were so many limitations. But you have to remember that your readers are in 2025 and, you know, women's lib is a thing. So, like,
Right.
creating a story where she is making the very best out of her situation as she can is going to be definitely a challenge for you. But there are definitely ways that you can do it. So, because again, your story is about freedom and your story is about empowerment. So, making sure that as she grows through the story, freedom and empowerment become a thing. And it's not just, oh, my mother was my jailer and now my husband is my jailer. So, I would definitely encourage you to kind of think about that as well
Okay.
as you go through the story. I don't know if any of that resonates with you or not, but
Yeah, definitely. I wasn't actually going to have her get married. I was
okay.
just going to have her view that as her only way out
Hmm.
and then have her fail at that multiple times. But you're right. I mean, she does need to look at it as a way for her to, I see her looking at it as more of finding somebody that she can manipulate versus somebody that's going to treat her well. Because
Perfect.
yeah, that's just kind of how I feel her right now.
Yeah. Well, and as you're talking about her failing at it, thinking about that as, is she intentionally failing at that?
Mhm.
Right? Or, because again, society being what it was back then, women being property, often women didn't have a choice in who they
No,
were going to marry. So if, her mother keeps setting her up with these men that she knows she can't manipulate, she can't control, it's going to be as bad or worse than her mother. Finding ways for her, especially in the early part of the story, being very impulsive and ruining things, even though it makes things worse for her, right? Like this
okay.
could be an opportunity, but no, she messes it up intentionally because she knows that's going to be worse than this, or she's afraid it's going to be worse than this. Again, gives the reader that realistic, right? Like you want the reader to feel like this isn't really an opportunity for her to make things better. So her acting impulsively, her doing something seemingly stupid in the moment because she doesn't have the forethought to think of the after effects can be really important. And having that friend for her to be able to say, why didn't you just made things worse for yourself. And she can be like, well, maybe it's worse, but maybe it's better because maybe here, right? Like giving her that person to talk to really help the reader understand that what's presumably the out isn't really the out. In the same way, we talked about the death of the mother being not just, oh, I have to make this decision, but really understanding the implications of why we have to make these choices. The only difference being kind of in the early part of the story, there's not a lot of forethought. It's just a lot of raw emotion, fear, anger, anxiety, desperation, all in the beginning. And then as over and over and over, she experiences highs and lows in her failures, and maybe a couple of steps forward and then gets knocked back a lot of steps. By the time she gets to a place where she can make the decision of how to escape and how to finally escape from her mother forever, right? Like those opportunities, it feels very understood and very decisive and kind of a moment of hope, even if that hope doesn't resonate all the way through to the end of the story, just in that moment, this is the right decision. And those two voices are distinct enough that you can easily, as an author, be able to write those two different voices. And if you're ready, we can kind of talk through how those two look distinct from one another.
Okay. Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, so when you're talking about someone who is desperate, um, they are going to have a lot of emotion in what they're saying. Um, she is um, a princess. So, despite the fact that she is trapped, she has a lot of people who like tell her, "Oh, you're a princess, right? Like you have this wonderful life." So there's a lot of privilege there. So there's probably not a lot of um, temperament there. She's probably loud. You're probably going to use a lot of exclamation points with her and a lot of hard periods of like she's used to speaking and other people listening. So her voice, even in her desperation, should be commanding. The best friend slash sibling that she has with her all the time, it probably plays more of a sidekick role. And Jenny, if any of this doesn't resonate with you, please stop me and say, no, no, that's not the direction I want to go. And I can give you different options. Um, but kind of thinking like trapped princess, there's a strength there that you want to portray. Also, readers love a strength story of like overcoming the obstacles. So I think that's really great. So, as I mentioned, lots of exclamation points, lots of commands, probably not a lot of questions. Um, Even when a question is being asked,
Okay.
it's in the form of a command. So, not
Okay.
why am I here? tell me why I'm here,
Okay.
right? That it seems like such a simple change, but by making it a command, you're showing the power that she has. And then, like when she's in a conversation with her mother and she says, tell me why I'm here, or tell me why you want to do this, the queen is going to be like, you don't talk to me like that, right? Like, and then she's kind of put in her place. But with everyone else, even probably the servants who are her captors, like she has that ability to give them orders, to boss them around, to act however she's going to act without really any repercussions other than the fact that she's not allowed to do everything that she wants to do. So
Yes.
by making those small adjustments in her language, you're showing the power that she has. Does all that feel good for you?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Um, I guess I do have a question though. So there's got to be a period of time, and maybe this doesn't happen in real time, it happens more in backstory, but when she is transitioning from that, innocent little happy girl to this kind of angry captive princess, so do I handle her voice differently then or what?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk about that voice
Oh,
in
okay.
just a minute.
Okay, sorry.
Because no, it's good. And I love that you're thinking about it. Um, when you're talking about that voice, there are a couple of things that are going to impact how you write that. So I just want to tell you like one or two other things about the like starting voice that feels the
Okay.
best to you, and then we can
Yeah.
kind of go backward and forward from that.
Okay. Okay.
Um, to help add to the intense emotionality, you probably want her to have very big body language. She throws herself on the bed. She points at things. She knocks things over. Again, she's a trapped princess. Like
Mhm.
all the power in the universe, itty bitty living space, right? Like this idea of this juxtaposition of like, if I really have all this power, right, I can break anything I want and nobody's going to yell at me for breaking it, but I just can't leave here, right? So like letting everything kind of be big and painful and the understanding of kind of like the desperation that we feel when we can't, I keep using that word because that's kind of how I picture her, right? Like
Mhm.
she's smart and she's capable and she could do so many other things, but she's trapped in this existence where nobody listens to her except that they all listen to her, right? Like that
Mhm.
kind of weirdness in the juxtaposition of her roles. Um, when you're writing that big body language, I would almost always put it in the middle of her lines. And this is what we talk about when we talk about cadence. So a big declaration and then body language as the tag, and then maybe a secondary sentence. So tell me why I'm here. She slammed her hand on the desk, and don't you dare lie to me,
Okay.
right? Big emotion, big action,
Mhm.
and then like following it up with, or I'll know if you're lying to me, right? I can't believe my mother won't listen to me. She throws herself on the bed. She's horrible and I hate her, right? Like big emotion, lots of exclamation points, lots of periods, big physicality, intense physicality, and then big words. And the reason that you can go so big and make it work is because when you rewind to her being a child, it's going to look really different. And when you fast forward to her being the planner and being able to think about things, things will slow down for her. Instead of everything being a declaration, tell me why I'm here, realizing that she's going to need other people's help, and if she wins them over, they're probably going to help her instead of her shouting and breaking things all the time, right? Like at some point in the middle of the story, as she's starting to realize that this doesn't work, being the petulant teenager all the time of like, okay, this isn't actually helping me. I actually have to start planning. Maybe at some point she actually starts apologizing. Maybe she picks something up because she's used to throwing something and she puts it back down and decides not to throw it. Instead of the actions always coming in the middle of the dialogue, she can start thinking about her action before she says something. So, like, as she's getting into the planning, escaping phase to this, instead of demanding, why does my mother treat me like this, throwing me on the bed? I hate her. She takes a deep breath and she's like, my mother, she has some internal thought. My mother is so cruel to me. She looks at the people around her and she says, thank you for helping me with this, right? Like something small and calm. And then as she's kind of finding the difference between those two, you pick some of the high points and some of the low points. So maybe she keeps the physicality for a long time before she changes her vocalizations. Or maybe she changes her vocalizations, but is still throwing stuff, right? But you can kind of find a way to make those two meet in the middle. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah. Yeah,
Does
definitely.
this feel aligned with the story that you want to tell?
It does.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So now let's go backward and let's talk about her voice as a child,
Okay.
right? Children's voices in and of themselves are very tricky because children look at the world differently than adults do. Adults are taught how to make connections between things. We can see thing one happened that caused thing two causes, right? Like causality, I guess is what intelligent people call that, instead of what, right, whatever. Um, like there's a word for it because someone smarter than me figured that out. But like we're taught this logic. We're taught that there are consequences to our actions, and children don't always understand that. Often they feel like proximity and emotion are what's causing the world around them. Which means they think differently, which means they talk differently. So as an adult, when we're telling a story, we start usually chronologically, right? This happened and then this happened and this happened. Children focus on the most intense feeling first, right? Whatever's causing them excitement or fear or grief, that comes first and they work their way backward, right? Like if you've ever talked to a 3 or 4 year old, it is so frustrating because you're trying to understand what happened. Like they're crying, what happened? And the thing that they're telling you about has nothing to do with what actually happened, but that's the thing that causes them the emotion. So the reason that this is important for you is because you have to decide how you're going to tell the child's story. Are you telling the child's story from Electra thinking back and remembering what happened and retelling it to someone else, which means that the story can happen chronologically because she's explaining it to someone and because she's thinking about it through the eyes of an adult or a pseudo adult? Or is she experiencing it as a child in the moment, in which case you want to really focus on the emotionality of the scene and less about the thought. Does that make any sense at all?
It makes sense. I don't know how I want to do it, but I
Okay.
get what you're saying.
Okay, so let's
Yeah.
talk about it both ways. So then you'll
Okay.
have the option kind of when you get into it.
Sure.
If you are telling the story through the eyes of young Electra, you don't want a lot of adult thinking. You just want the high point of the emotion. So let's take an example of her wanting comfort from her mother, right?
Mhm.
So um, actually, let me tell it through the eyes of an adult first, or the older version of her, and let me go backward. It's easier for me to think of it that way because, again, as an adult, we kind of
Yeah.
think about what we experienced and then we can turn it around. So she's in her room. she's feeling lonely because she doesn't have her sister to play with. She might be still a little too young to understand that her sister is gone forever. So she goes to her mother and asks her mother when her sister is coming back. And her mother says something horrible like, don't you know she's never coming back? Maybe she even blames her. I wish it was you. You know, why can't you understand this? Why are you bothering me? And then Electra gets very upset about it and wants to hug her mother because she remembers back when her sister was alive, her mother played with her all the time, and now she doesn't play with her anymore. And then maybe her mother pushes her away and then tells one of the servants to just take care of that and walks away, right? Very traumatic. Everyone can understand how even like looking back on that as a child, even if it wasn't us as a child, we can see all of like those pain points.
Yeah.
When we tell the story through Electra's eyes as she's experiencing it, maybe she's sitting on the floor and she's playing with her dolls and she's like, maybe she calls out to her sister and her sister doesn't answer. And then she thinks, oh, that's right, she's not here. When is she coming back? And she maybe looks to the servant and says, because presumably she's even, you know, even like every generation, every culture, every civilization takes care of their children. So presumably there's somebody there watching her, and she asks
Yeah.
a question, and the servant doesn't actually know what to say, and or maybe the servant starts to cry, and she's like, "But she's coming back. Like, why is she crying?" Um, Mother will know, right? Like, not I will go ask my mother because she will know. Mother will know, right? So she stands up and she goes into, I don't know, the throne room. I'm totally making stuff up in your story.
You're right.
Sorry. Okay. She goes into the throne room and like she thinks, oh, I'll bring my mother an apple. It's her favorite, right? Like apples make mother happy, right? And she goes and she like tries to give the apple to her mother, and her mother like throws it away or pushes it away. And she's like, why, right? Like, and then maybe she asks about her sister and her mother says something terrible, and not, oh, my mother is grieving. Oh, this is so sad, but I don't understand, right? Like that confusion, that frustration, that hurt, that's what we want to feel in that moment, not the thought behind it. So often I recommend writing whatever scene it is in an adult voice and then pulling out the adult to highlight the moments of the child.
Okay.
Kind of works both ways, but that's how I would do it. I would really focus on the desire for what like children just want to be happy. They just want to be loved. They just want to spend time with people that they love. So like those are the moments that you want to highlight. Oh, I will go ask. Mommy will know. She'll give me a hug. I'm sad because sister's not here. What do you mean sister's not, when is she coming back? What do you mean she's not coming back? She always comes back. Everybody comes back, right? Like we don't have this understanding of permanence and death, right? Like, and those are the kinds of things that you're going to want to highlight in there because the emotional realism of that as a child, either through the lens of what it was like for me to feel like that, or the actual showing of it is going to help your reader feel connected to what that loss felt like, excuse me, and what being pushed away by the person who's supposed to comfort you in this time is going to do, so that fast forward to when she's an adult and she's desperate and she's throwing things and she's breaking things and she's demanding, we understand where that comes from because it's like, well, you're not going to give it to me. I'm going to hold on as tightly as I can.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, that all makes complete sense.
okay. Anything in there that you want a deeper explanation of, or anything that doesn't feel like it fits in your story that you want a different option for?
Um, I'm gonna have a problem writing loud, but I'll try. But I do have a question, and I think I
Mhm.
know the answer, but I guess I'd be curious to hear what you think. So, is there any point at which Electra realizes that the reason her mother was pushing her away all those years ago was that's how she was handling her own grief? Or, and it really had nothing to do with Electra at all? Or is it or is that too internal for somebody like Electra?
That is a fantastic question. And I think the answer to it needs to be dependent on what you're trying to convey to the reader
At the end?
at any point in the story, right? Like if that becomes part of her understanding of going from me, right now, right now, right now, to there needs to be a better plan, um, then yes, that realization absolutely can be part of the impact of the change in who she is, right? Like she can absolutely experience or see something, maybe her mother just set her up with another one of these men who's going to make her life just even more miserable. And she's going to demand that her mother change her mind. And she stomps into her mother's room and she finds her mother like practically comatose on the floor, still calling her sister's name after all of these years. And then in that moment, she can understand that the grief hasn't just affected her, but that shouldn't be a complete 180 for her. So
Okay.
if she's experiencing these things, if she's realizing these things, they should soften her and they should change her. It doesn't necessarily mean forgiveness. And you can do that a couple of ways. You can do it in the way we just explained, where she's experiencing her mother's grief now, um, in that way, or you can have somebody else try to explain things to her, right? Like, so the next part of the scene where her mother pushes her away in the throne room and tells somebody else to take care of her, and all of that, she's crying and the servant comes over and the servant wraps her arms around her and says, "It's okay, love, we'll get through this." And she looks at the servant and she feels happy because she loves the servant and the servant's taking care of her. It's not her mom, but she has this space and she has this love. And the servant can say, "Your mom's grieving too. Your mom is very sad," right? Like, so she's hearing it all of these years as she's growing up, but it's not a justification, right? Like grief, it doesn't change the fact that she was hurt by her mother's actions, even though she can explain and understand and empathize with her mother. So absolutely, it can and should be a point in your story, because if you as the author don't address it, your reader is going to think about, well, her mom was grieving too. Where's the grace? Where's the, space for her? If you put that in there in the book and then you have Electra say, "But I was a child," right? But I
Mhm.
needed that as a mother. Yes, it was hard for her, but she didn't have to be cruel, right? Like she could have distanced herself, but she didn't have to be hurtful, right? Like I could have understood the absence. I can't understand the cruelty, or whatever you decide the dynamic is, like
Mhm.
helping the reader to understand that there can be empathy, but forgiveness and empathy don't necessarily have to go hand in hand, or forgiveness and the repercussions of it, right? Like you're still living with the hurt and the trauma, even if forgiveness, right? Like, again, we talked about it a little bit earlier, where it's messy, right? Right and wrong, hurt and love, like it's messy. And the more you can put that into your story and explain the emotions through the eyes of Electra, the easier it is for your audience and your readers to go, "I get it. I get it. It's okay to love somebody and hate them at the same time, or forgive them and hate them." And right, like there's a lot of depth to that you can put in there.
Okay.
Um, the characters surrounding her can be that voice, especially if they do this a lot in teen shows and young adult stories, where as a teenager, most shows are written like the teenager is just going to do whatever the teenager's going to do, even though the whole world around them, they have a very smart best friend that's like, "Have to think about the consequences. This is a really bad idea. Don't you think maybe?" Right? Like there's always that voice of someone they trust that they don't listen to in the story. So that definitely gives you space to write that, to have somebody saying, "But what about this thing?" And her going, "But what about me?" Right?
Yeah.
gives you that space to do it. So I love that
Yeah,
question.
I like that because in the ancient, there's one of the ancient texts where she does have that friend who does play that exact role, and Electra's just like, nope, I'm over it. I hate my mother and I'm gonna kill her.
Yep.
So she just absolutely doesn't listen. So, but
Yeah.
I kind of like your version of that better, where it's less cut and like just absolute hatred and vengeance and revenge, and because that's really hard to relate to, but it's a lot easier to relate to neglect and emotional trauma. So
Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah.
like that.
And, neglect and emotional trauma can absolutely 100% turn into pure hatred. And if
Yeah.
you tell the story that way, where it's like time and time and time again, she's beat down and there's nothing left of the love because the only thing her mother taught her was hate, that makes sense too. That story works too. But I think the reason that as we explain the backstory, it resonates more is because we're understanding the backstory. It's not just one point in time. No, I hate my mother. No, she has to die. It doesn't matter what you're telling me about her. It's hard to empathize with that one moment in time because
Mhm.
it's so foreign to most of us, right? Most of us have been in a relationship where we've gotten hurt because we hurt the people that are closest to us because they're the ones we spend the most time with, right?
Mhm.
Like it's almost inevitable.
Mhm.
And when that happens, like we heal from that and we grow and we understand that. It's hard for us to understand so much hatred in just one moment. But if you give us the backstory for the hatred, well, now maybe there's something to be understood. So,
Yeah. Yep. Yep. I like that. So
okay, great. Is there anything else, story or character wise, that I can maybe help you with?
I don't think so right now. I think that's
Okay.
good.
All right. Well, great. I'm going to go ahead and turn the recording off.